Yeah. So happy birthday to the king, Dr. Martin Luther, that is. Today is his birthday, even though his day is actually celebrated tomorrow. So every year about this time, I do a video like this because of what I noticed is a lot of people really don't know the facts. A lot of people really don't know anything other than the whitewashed version of what they teach you about Dr. King. So because of that, they have the audacity to disrespect and undermine and do all this counterintelligence misinformation campaign regurgitation of J. Edgar Hoover in most cases. And a lot of times most of the times we're talking about people who really have no receipts for doing anything. People like really, it's the audacity when your only contribution, if you want to call it that, is some post on Facebook or some tweets or some Instagram post of sharing some memes. Yet you'll fix your raggedy lips to speak against someone whose sacrifice you benefit from today. Because really, if you think about it, most of the people that say some of this reckless stuff are people who don't do shit. So we're going to put some respect on King's name today. That's what we're going to do. Because even the ones that we revere, like Dr. Khalid Abdul Muhammad, rest in peace, happy belated, never spoke ill about King. So who are you? See, the reason why he never spoke ill about King because he was a warrior scholar. Meaning he looked deeper than the whitewashed version of MLK that you use to undermine him. As if you would have sacrificed, as if you have ever. Let me ask y'all a question. Have y'all ever been to jail? Anybody out there that sees this? Have you ever been to jail? Okay, what for? Because I'm assuming at least some people said yes. So what have you been to jail for? You got caught with some weed? Okay, that happens. You was getting it like you live. Okay. Whatever reason you might have been in jail before, if you've ever been to jail, it wasn't because you were standing on principles to try to move the culture forward and fight against the unjust system for the future generations of your people. I highly doubt you've been to jail for that. You haven't sat in a cold cell starving because you knew even though you wouldn't see the change that needs to come, it would come and you wanted to contribute to that. You never faced dogs, tanks, guns, soldiers, mercenary police officers in the South for standing on a principle of helping your people. But you'll throw shade at MLK. How sway. And these same cats, these are the cats with the fancy names on social media. The ones that will post some memes as if it's real scholarship. But they're the same ones who's only using information that came from sources of people who hated King. I'm gonna play a couple videos, some things you may not know. I'm actually gonna play a video of a white boy breaking down how and why they had to whitewash MLK. But the reason why I know these people who speak all of this bullshit about King is because they don't even understand or know history. Because they regurgitate the same tired ass lines like they only gave us King Day because blah, 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 blah. When in reality, they didn't give us MLK Day. We created it. We made it. They at some point finally in the 80s acknowledged it. But these are the same people that will tell you that Black History Month was also given to us in February because it's the shortest month of the year. Because, first of all, they speak from a defeated mindset. They speak from a defeated perspective. So they can't fathom ever having any type of gains without it coming with permission from them. So, and then they don't even have enough scholarship. They don't even have enough basic general history to know things like, well, first of all, Black History Month was created by Carter G. Woodson, and it started as Black History Week. And the week in February they chose was based upon the supposed birthday of Frederick Douglass and also Abraham Lincoln. Then it expanded to the month. It wasn't chosen or given to us. We created it once again. And we created it specifically at a particular time for a particular reason. Maybe you should have a little bit more confidence in the intellect of your ancestors. Or take that fancy name off and go back to Toby. So you guys regurgitate, some of you guys regurgitate the same tired lines, and it's misinformation. Another word for misinformation is counterintelligence. That's really what it is. You talk about the integration. Because you're really just trying to impress your peers. It's high level capping is basically what it is. You speak about the integration. It's MLK's fault that there's integration. It's MLK's fault. Integration killed us. It ruined us as a people. We were doing great before that. But do you send your children to public schools? Or do you send them to a black only school? Do you send them to public schools, integrated public schools? As you throw shade on MLK, are you actually utilizing some of the opportunities that he sacrificed for directly while you criticize this dude? Are you that ungrateful? You make it seem like in the 60s we were doing so great with the schools. Like we just had schools popping in every community. We didn't. And the ones that we did have were typically underfunded and lacked sufficient resources, similar to black schools today in some communities. So the fact that you went to a public school, sent your children to one, you should actually be saluting. See, the integration piece wasn't just about, luncheons and diners. Yeah, you should have the right to eat at Denny's because y'all eat at Denny's. That doesn't mean you don't spend with the black businesses too. It just means you're being respected and recognized as a man, as a human being. You don't have to spend 98% of your money with them. You choose to. 60 plus years after his death and still blame it on him. How many of y'all was born in a hospital? Your kids, were they born in a hospital? Yeah. That's another public service that you pay with your taxes that at one point you didn't even have the opportunity or right to use. Because if you go back far enough, you'll see that a lot of our people was born in rickety shacks or outhouses or somewhere in the house, which is probably why the mortality rate was so high. So now you born in a public hospital, birth your children in public hospital, but not putting any respect on the reason why you can do that. And acting like integration was the worst thing, but you're utilizing the resources allotted to you because of the integration. And I'm not saying there's no value in us operating separately and circulating our money and resources. What I'm saying is, let's not pretend that you don't have the right and the ability more than ever to centralize your resources and support your own. Let's not pretend that you're not taking advantage of what came with the integration. Don't act like you would really have the courage to stand on your principles like MLK did. What would you do if you were in his time? Since you want to act like the nonviolence is such a problem, because you ain't about that. But you obviously are about that because you're on Facebook. You're not in the streets, because the ones in the streets respect the struggle. They respect the sacrifice, even if they don't agree. So what would you be doing in the 60s? You'd probably be doing what you're doing now, which is criticizing and undermining cats that are putting in work for you and your future. That's probably what you'd be doing. You'd probably be doing what you're doing now. The same things that you do right now is probably what you'd have been doing back then, except for you probably would have had a heavy serving of butter biscuit, buck dancing, cooning. Let's keep it a buck. Be real. Be honest with yourself. You guys regurgitate the same. This is what I'm saying. It's counterintelligence. You guys are regurgitating the same lines, the same perspective, the same ideas, the same sentiments as those who killed them. But you're woke. It's funny how these days, it seems like within the last couple of years, those who claim to be the wokest start to parrot white supremacist talking points and sentiments. That's why they'll act like Kanye West is just so revolutionary for saying white lives matter and putting swastikas on his clothes. And now you want to pretend the swastika is something that we really used to rock with. It's a sun symbol, it's a peace symbol, it's harmony, it's this and that. When you've never seen anyone rock that for any other reason but to promote white supremacy. So you regurgitate the same talking points that was used to assassinate the character of MLK. You want to bring up an alleged adultery, an affair that he had that's not ever been documented and verified. And you want to use that as a reason to undermine his sacrifice, when even his wife didn't do that. Like, if his wife isn't upset or never accused him of adultery, who are you to 60 years later? Anyway, let's get to it's been wow. Let's get to some of this video that I seen on YouTube. This white dude who's actually breaking down some of the things, like why they had to whitewash him. We'll just start it off like this. I'm gonna let this play for a minute, y'all.
An effort that is immortalized in the Reagan years. Why Reagan? Because Reagan is the guy who made MLK Day a national holiday. As such, you'll sometimes hear dweebs claim this 6'1" flake of dandruff brought to life was actually proof of how the great American patriot can reconcile the country's racist history and become the biggest champion of racial justice. But that's wrong. Because for a guy like Reagan to become the MLK Day guy, a lot needed to change about how America viewed MLK. The Reverend could no longer be the radical extremist despised by over 2/3 of the country, the most hated man in America. He had to become an empty shell for any vague sentiment of justice. And most importantly, he had to be the colorblind guy. Because how did Reagan really feel about the civil rights movement? Let's take this quote from an article in The Nation. Reagan opposed every major piece of civil rights legislation adopted by Congress, including the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and the Fair Housing Act of 1968. As president, Reagan supported tax breaks for schools that discriminated on the basis of race, opposed the extension of the Voting Rights Act, vetoed the Civil Rights Restoration Act, and decimated the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. When you combine Reagan's political record with his symbolic stance on race issues, his deriding welfare recipients as welfare queens, his employing states' rights rhetoric in the same county where, in 1964, 3 of the most infamous murders of civil rights workers occurred, his initial opposition to establish a national holiday to commemorate Martin Luther King Jr., the Reagan legacy begins to lose much of its luster. And that's putting this outwardly racist guy's legacy extremely mildly. So then, why would Reagan suddenly flip on this issue, and why would the "I have a dream" line become the rallying call for every politician trying to score easy popularity points? 2 academics explain it pretty clearly in this article. The focus on "I have a dream" in public discourse also made King ripe for appropriation because the emphasis on one speech and one issue served to obscure King's many other speeches and writings, as well as his less successful ventures, such as his effort to desegregate Chicago, his opposition to the Vietnam War, and the Poor People's Campaign. As early as 1964, for example, King praised the Indian government's preferential college admissions policy for untouchables, and argued that the United States must also find ways of atoning for the injustices she has inflicted upon her Negro citizens. The civil rights leader called for a broad-based and gigantic Bill of Rights for the disadvantaged, parallel with the GI Bill of Rights, for a guaranteed annual income, and for restitution in the form of radical changes in the structure of society that would provide African Americans with compensation in education, housing, employment, and healthcare. The public focus on "I Have a Dream," with its simple poetic beauty.
So right there you can see, and there's a lot more evidence, that he was about reparations. He was about being compensated for the injustices against us. They don't tell you that part, though. They tell you, "I have a dream," and little white boys, little white girls, and package it up. And they only do that because once they did acknowledge the holiday that we created, they wanted to make sure they contained the message. And obviously it works because a lot of people fall for it. So what they do is they had to whitewash it, because the message was not gonna die. See, they thought when they killed him and it was good, but it wasn't. So since the message wasn't gonna die, they had to control the message. Understand that.
Overshadowed the specific proposals that King had recommended in order to achieve his dream, again making it much easier for President Reagan to appropriate King for his own uses. And those uses were gutting the policies MLK advocated for in favor of the Reaganomic free market liberalism that funneled wealth from the poor to the wealthy, which, given how wealth distribution looks in this country, also meant from many black people to very few white people. But the trick is that focusing exclusively on the "I have a dream" speech and misinterpreting it entirely allowed neoliberals to turn MLK into some weird conservative libertarian who wouldn't have wanted all this big government stuff that took into account people's race in its effort to redress the historical wrongs that made one group of colonized and enslaved people materially worse off than the people who colonized them. Dr. King would have hated redistribution, trust me. He loved and definitely wanted more of that sweet, sweet free market capitalism and the colonial and chattel slavery systems it was born out of. He doesn't want a race-conscious system of justice. That doesn't sound very colorblind, guys. Doesn't sound very content of our character. My best buddy MLK would definitely not approve. But of course he did. Don't be fooled. Actually listen to the guy for once.
And the greed and exploitation which create the sector of poverty in the midst of wealth. Again, we have deluded ourselves into believing the myth that capitalism grew and prospered out of the Protestant ethic of hard work and sacrifice. The fact is that capitalism was built on the exploitation and suffering of black slaves, and continues to thrive on the exploitation of the poor, both black and white, both here and abroad. We must also realize that the problems of racial injustice and economic injustice cannot be solved without a radical redistribution of political and economic power.
That sounds reparationish to me. That sounds like he understood the economics necessary to really acquire justice. It sounds like he's pretty much on code with what we're saying today. But this ain't the part that I don't remember learning about this part in junior high, is what I'm saying. So I get it. I get why people don't know this. I get why people have a misconception and a false narrative. I even get why people be like, well, he was about nonviolence, and I don't agree with that nonviolence. But really, obviously, you do agree with that nonviolence because you ain't in the streets. And really understand why he went the nonviolence route. Is because he saw trying to rise up in an all-out conflict as suicide. And obviously you do too. That's why you ain't doing it. That's why you're on social media. So that was a tactic. That was him saying, hey, there's other ways that we can attack this beast and obtain what we're trying to obtain. But he even backed away from speaking so adamantly about nonviolence because he understood after a minute, like, hey, I can't keep saying this when they're sending us to war. See, I had a YouTube channel that's now been taken down, and I shared some speeches of MLK from 66, 67, 68, some of them that he gave in different countries, speaking about the war, speaking about the two Americas, speaking about a lot of different things and saying things that to this day are revolutionary, to this day are progressive, to this day are more raw and uncut than most of the leaders would say today, especially publicly with a platform like he had. Maybe let's continue.
We must further recognize that the ghetto is a domestic colony. Black people must develop programs that will aid in the transfer of power and wealth into the hands of residents of the ghetto so that they may in reality control their own destinies.
And that's
hold
just
up, hold up, hold up.
Ghetto so that they may that will aid We must further recognize that the ghetto is a domestic colony. Black people must develop programs that will aid in the transfer of power and wealth into the hands of residents of the ghetto so that they may in reality control their own destinies.
And that's just two
Hold up. You guys, you're telling me that this dude is soft? This dude didn't know what was up? Well, you're telling me that you have a more radical stance, disposition, and actions behind it that you can criticize and undermine him. Or are you telling me you just didn't know this side? Because I can understand that part. But that's the point. The point is we don't know this side. The point is they had to whitewash him after he became so popular, even after death. After we created a holiday to honor this man, and they finally decided decades later to recognize it, well, they couldn't recognize it knowing he's going to be more popular than ever without making sure they controlled the narrative. And because we didn't have social media at that time, we couldn't offset their misrepresentation. But it also means that we have more access to the information, so we really don't have no excuse to be regurgitating counterintelligence misinformation talking points.
Snippets out of many. Watch this video if you want a more complete picture. The point is, MLK readily admitted the incredible damage capitalism had produced in the United States, and explicitly advocated working through government measures, not the free market, to address the gulf between the poor and the rich, and the black and the white. Don't misinterpret me here, he didn't just advocate for government measures, but he certainly valued them tremendously. Anyway, the truth is that these are uncomfortable quotes for an American society that has never realized MLK's goals, but that has very much elevated MLK to the status of an untouchable god of justice. There's a dichotomy there that's too difficult to actually address, too uncomfortable. He's great and perfect and a visionary, but also we didn't listen to him. How do you own up to something like that? Well, you don't. It's much easier to retell his story disingenuously, obscuring the parts which contradict the fantasy of American exceptionalism and the steady march of progress towards a more perfect democracy than it is to act.
And let me say this, understand why it's dangerous when we have people who undermine without understanding, or because of their cowardice, or because really they're just hypocrites, pretending that there's something that they're not. See, the first known attempt on MLK's life wasn't the one that took him out. The first actual attempt was some black lady who tried to kill him, I think in New York. She tried to stab him with a, what was it? I want to say a letter opener or something. Pierced him in the chest, barely missing his heart. Which is why he had that speech, if I would have sneezed. Because if he would have sneezed, it probably would have ruptured his heart. So this lady, this woman who looked like us, who tried to assassinate him, reportedly said that the reason she wanted to kill him was because he was stirring up trouble for the good niggers. In other words, his message was so radical at that time, it upsetted people so much that she was afraid there would be backlash. So she wanted to get rid of him for massa. That's the energy that some of you guys are harnessing with the bullshit. Just know that.
Actually challenge the poverty that capitalism and the exploitation of non-white others has wrought. Textbooks are probably the place this contradiction between MLK as a hero and American society not listening is most obvious. In an article titled "The Limits of Master Narratives in History Textbooks," Professor of Education Derek P. Aldridge looks at exactly this phenomenon with MLK. He describes how American history textbooks, and the overarching narratives they shape and are shaped by, have killed the reality of MLK's life. By elevating him to the status of a messiah, framing him as the embodiment of the entire civil rights movement, and then trying to make him appear as if he was a moderate, the way American history has told MLK's struggle has served to sidestep questions too uncomfortable for it to ask. Questions of poverty, capitalism, and war. Questions that are not neatly answered with the end of Jim Crow laws. Questions that still endure to this day and that bring together MLK and the people he is so often depicted as an adversary of, like Malcolm X or the Black Panther Party. Giving a proper place to these facets of MLK's politics and his proximity to the figures only remembered as radicals would raise too many questions about the legitimacy of the narrative American textbooks are so attached to. Constant, predictable, and certain progress. Because if textbooks started depicting MLK accurately as an anti-war, anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist, they would risk undermining the image of American democracy as the perfect representation of the will of the people and the true realization of justice. The truth is that King's dreams never came true for most of the issues he fought against. And even if they had, MLK was not the civil rights movement. He was just one face of it. And the civil rights movement was not a single-issue movement. It had a long list of demands that still remain unheard. He is not the proof that American democracy works, and he was not an enemy to the radicals that shared his same ideas. But here in the US, we don't just settle on whitewash.
So there's that. That's actually a good video to watch. Since y'all don't want to hear it from me, you can hear it from a white dude. But anyway, let's continue on with this. I got a few more videos I want to show before I end this. This is just a short one, right quick. I'm sure some of y'all have seen this one. We saying cut the check. He said cut the check. Cut the crap and cut the check. So he was calling out things that a lot of y'all won't call out right now, except for on social media behind your fancy pictures and your fancy name. Let's keep it a buck. He's calling out things that these house Negroes that they put in front of us don't call out today. So let's stop the cap. Let's see what else we got.
So we suffer from a kind of poverty of the spirit, which stands in glaring contrast to our scientific and technological abundance. The problem is, my friends, that we have learned to fly the air like birds, and we have learned to swim the seas like fish, and yet we haven't learned to walk the earth like brothers and sisters. Racial injustice is still the black man's burden and the white man's shame. So wherever we live in America, we have to face the fact honestly that racial discrimination is present. So don't get complacent. Certainly we've made some strides. We've made some progress here and there, but it hadn't been enough. It hadn't been fast enough. And although we've come a long, long way, we still have a long, long way to go. In 1863, the Negro was freed from the bondage of physical slavery through the Emancipation Proclamation signed by Abraham Lincoln. But the Negro was not given any land to make that freedom meaningful. And you know, it was something like having a man in jail for years and years, and then you suddenly discover that this man is innocent. And go to him and say, now you are free. The man's been unjustly jailed for 35 or 40 years, and you just put him out of jail saying, now you are free. Don't give him any bus fare to get to town, no money to buy any clothes, no money to get something to eat. This is what happened to the black man in this country. I can't limit my concern to the middle class. I can't limit my concern to this particular situation where a Negro comes and says, I'm the first this. I'm just tired of the first Negro. I want some seconds and some thirds and some fourths. The civil rights movement has to address itself to this, and the nation has to do it. You see, we are such a rich nation and affluent nation. We often don't see the poor. There are some, you see, most white people can't see the poor because they live in the suburbs. And then they get in town in these big cities on expressways. They don't know nothing about Watts. They've never been there. They don't know anything about Huff in Cleveland or the west side or the south side of Chicago or Harlem. They've never seen it. And they allow the poor to become invisible. And a lot of Negroes, you know, who have somehow sailed or floated out of the backwaters or the muddy waters, and they've kind of been able to ease out into the fresh flowing waters of the mainstream, have forgotten the stench of the backwater. And I can hear a voice saying that wasn't enough. I was hungry, and you fed me not. I was naked, and you clothed me not. I needed shelter, and you didn't give it to me. I needed a drink of water. And in a world that's 3/4 water, you made me pay a water bill.
So it should be clear at this point that Dr. King was a black nationalist revolutionary on the level of our most revered to this day. He spoke about the necessity of land and reparations and economic base, spending with our own, banking black, insuring ourselves with black insurance companies, etc. However, he did understand, especially at that time, that we had to have access to resources that we lacked immediately, especially those resources that we actually paid for through tax money. That's really what the quote unquote integration stance was about. It was about we're paying taxes for schools, but we can't send our children to any of these schools. We have to send them to some raggedy, broke down school, underfunded. He understood that we didn't have hospitals, but we paid taxes for public hospitals that we can't take our babies to be born in. And since you probably take advantage and utilize both of those particular resources, you probably shouldn't be criticizing and undermining someone who died for what you take advantage of today. I'm pretty sure we've all used public transportation at some time, at some point. And maybe, I know when I was younger and I had to ride the bus, I would sit on the back of the bus on purpose. Not because I had to, though. I ain't never had to get up out my seat for anybody. Unless I wanted to because it was an elder or something. So if you've ever utilized public transportation and you sat where you wanted to and kept your seat, then quit acting like MLK killed the black nation with the integration piece. Be real. Anyway, let's end this with this last speech. This is like one of the moving speeches. Because let's remember, as a lot of y'all will cap, but you've never been in a situation where you had to demonstrate the type of courage that Dr. King did. Because you never have, obviously, and you probably never would go to somewhere you knew you were probably going to die if you went and proceeded in addressing the issues that you knew would get you killed. Because MLK wrote his own eulogy the day before he was killed. That means he knew or had a strong feeling his end was coming. And he still treaded the course and offered himself, knowing he wouldn't see physically what he was fighting for manifest. And if the fact that he wrote his own eulogy the day before he died isn't enough for you to know this, this should be. Respect the sacrifice of King. Ashe.
Understand the denial of certain basic First Amendment because they haven't committed themselves to that over there. But somewhere all we say to America is true to what you said on paper. If I lived in China or even Russia or any totalitarian country, maybe I could understand some of these illegal injunctions. Maybe I could understand the denial of certain basic First Amendment privileges because they haven't committed themselves to that over there. But somewhere I read of the freedom of assembly. Somewhere I read of the freedom of speech. Somewhere I read of the freedom of press. Somewhere I read that the greatness of America is the right to protest far right. And so just as I say we aren't going to let any dogs or water hoses turn us around, we aren't going to let any injunction turn us around. Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory